So, I want to talk about To an Athlete Dying Young by A.E. Housman. This is a great poem. It's pretty well known. A lot of people do like it. I still think it's underrated, and there's an element of it in particular that a lot of people miss that's super great, and it has to do with the phrase Fleetfoot in the penultimate verse. If you haven't read the poem, it's very good, and it's very short. You can pause the video to read it. Otherwise, I'll just start with my analysis. So, to briefly summarize the poem, in verse 1, the speaker recalls celebrating a young athlete's victory. In the second verse, the speaker recalls the more recent event following the death of the athlete, of them being carried by pallbearers into a cemetery. In verses 3 to 5, the speaker tells the athlete it's good he died young because he won't become a washed-up old man reliving former glories. Metaphors are established between life and plants, life and a field, glory or victory, and a laurel wreath, which historically was given to victors of sports competitions to wear as a crown. And finally, in the final two verses, the speaker asserts that had the athlete grown old, he would have been surpassed and forgotten. By dying young, his accomplishments and the admiration directed toward him are made permanent and everlasting. The final verse is pretty clever, in my opinion. Housman sets up laurel as a metaphor for glory in verse 3. There he talks about it withering quicker than the rose of life, whereas in the final verse, it is unwithered despite the athlete being dead. This makes it clear that the athlete's victories, like the laurel wreath, have been frozen in time and can't wither or fade. Time is also explicitly referenced by the word briefer. For girls, garlands are brief in both size and time. Their heads are small, and thus the garlands must also be. But the garlands are also short-lived. Once girls get too old, they don't spend too much time knitting together flowers into small crowns. They outgrow the wreaths, both literally and figuratively. And so it is with the athlete and his victories. The execution of the metaphors is part of what makes this poem so great. Even the use of light to represent life and darkness to represent death, which is seen in poetry to the point of exhaustion, is made really effective here because it's connected to the specific setting of the funeral where this poem would be expected to be read. You have a literal hole in the ground where it's light above ground and dark in the shade of the hole, and the body literally transitions from being above ground to being below ground. The word threshold in the second verse is apropos because the opening to the grave is a literal threshold, but it's also being used metaphorically as the threshold between the realm of the living and the dead. Now, as I mentioned before, Fleetfoot is the thing that's underestimated in this poem. Besides sounding, exceptionally pretty, it's a synecdochic phrase, meaning a part is standing in for a whole. Foot is standing in for the body, so fleetfoot means the fast person or the runner, the same way that, flatfoot or gumshoe are used as informal names for a detective. But again, the literal interpretation of the phrase extends to the actual environment where this poem would be read. As a fast foot hits a surface, it literally echoes, and a sill, meaning a windowsill, is the flat surface at the bottom of a window. So a foot literally could echo off a windowsill, but in this case, the sill of shade refers to part of the metaphorical window or threshold into an afterlife, but can also mean the literal but different threshold of the grave that the athlete is moved through into the shade of his grave. So these lines transition you from life to death. So set before its echoes fade, the fleet foot. That's the runner in life, their feet kicking up dirt on the racetrack. But the sill of shade refers to the grave the young athlete is being put in their transition to the afterlife. And again, before its echoes fade, it connects to the idea that we're freezing time, that the runner seamlessly transitions from life to death, and their legacy as a star athlete is being preserved before their reputation can fade in their old age, just the same way that the sound of feet echoes and those echoes fade into silence. But the phrase fleetfoot is doing more here than most readers realize, and that's understandable because fleet is not such a common word as it was when this poem was written. But in looking at recorded definitions of fleet, you can find an old meaning for the word as an adjective, meaning not penetrating deep as soil, and knowing that the phrase is always synecdochical, with the foot standing in for the body, we can read the phrase not only as fast foot, meaning the runner in life, but also body not penetrating deeply into soil, perhaps just 6 feet or so, meaning the runner dead and buried. So not only is fleetfoot one of the most beautiful phrases in all of English poetry, and it just rolls off the tongue beautifully, as is commonly observed by readers of this poem, but it represents the runner in life and death simultaneously, making the same poignant contrast as the first two verses of the poem, but now in two words. And that remarkable poetic achievement is not recognized often enough, but should be. So Fleetfoot is in the running for the most perfect two-word phrase in all of poetry, in my opinion. Now, in that same verse, having just referenced the windowsill, we move on to a lintel, which is a beam over the top of a window, which distributes the weight from the wall around it. This overhead beam is almost like a shelf, where you could, say, put a trophy. So the athlete in life is connected to a literal window, which connects to a metaphorical window or threshold, which is instantiated as a literal threshold into the ground, with the real-world metaphor for the lintel being perhaps the headstone of the grave. So the entire verse paints a unified picture of the athlete in both life and death. So the metaphors are just perfectly executed here. The speaker's silver lining that the memory of the athlete in the peak of their life is going to be preserved in their death is something that the poem helps to accomplish. Housman deliberately fuses the positive memory of the athlete into the event of their death. He starts with two very similar scenes from life and death in the first two verses, then states his intentions while establishing metaphors that he can then leverage to blend an image of the athlete in life and death in just a single verse, the fifth, which itself contains another blend of the athlete in life and death in just the two-word phrase, Fleetfoot. The structure of this poem is perfect. The prose is perfect. The metaphors are perfect. This poem's just perfect, and I love it. It's loved and appreciated, but it's still underappreciated. It's one of the best poems ever made, and my personal favorite. And the core message of the poem is both taboo and true. Athletes do generally live to see their reputations tarnished, and that's not a predicament unique to athletes. This poem actually makes me think of Kurt Cobain, who, of course, died by suicide at the height of his popularity. He left behind a note that included the phrase, "Better to burn out than fade away," which recalls from this poem the line, "Set before its echoes fade." Kurt Cobain really was immortalized by his death. He did not fade away, and nor did his reputation as a musical artist. It's unfortunate that he engineered his own death. I wouldn't say that was the correct choice on his part, but it did have the intended silver lining, and so it is with the athlete in the poem. It's not good that he died, but the silver lining that he'll be remembered more fondly as a result, although taboo, is most likely true. And apart from how perfectly executed it is, the fact that Housman's goal is to express a bitter truth is kind of brave on his part. And I'm just going to close with my own reading of this unique and beautiful poem. To an athlete dying young. The time you won your town the race, we cheered you through the marketplace. Man and boy stood cheering by, and home we brought you shoulder high. Today, the road all runners come. Shoulder high we bring you home, and set you at your threshold down, Townsman of the stiller town. Smart lad, to slip betimes away from fields where glory does not stay, and early though the laurel grows, it withers quicker than the rose. Eyes the shady night his shut cannot see the record gut. Silence sounds no worse than cheers after earth has stopped the ears. Now, you will not swell the rout of lads who wore their honors out, runners whom renown outran and the name died before the man. So set before its echoes fade, the fleet foot on the sill of shade, and hold to the low lintel up the still defended challenge cup. And round that early laureled head will flock to graze the strengthless dead, and find unwithered on its curls the garland briefer than a girl's.